Okay, so this is chapter 4, looking at transitions from colonies to states. So it's going to be a lot of the pre-American Revolution stuff. All right, so starting out with the English colonies, just kind of an intro. English colonies had a lot more freedom than a lot of the other European nations. Guaranteed the rights of Englishmen early on. New England had essentially been self-governing. Very little involvement by England, by the monarchy. They were less militaristic, less centralized than people like Spain or France had with their colonies. The monarch shares power with Parliament at this point. Citizens had very specific rights, specific privileges. English colonists did not have all the rights of Englishmen. That was one of their big complaints, is they didn't have a voice in shaping administrative policies, but they developed a sense of their own rights because in a lot of ways they're left alone to their own decisions. A lot of that came from the English Civil War. The effects is a very fractured relationship between England and the colonies, a lot less money coming into America at this point, a lot of confusion over the relationship with the colonists, with England. They have the Navigation Acts, but they've really not been enforced as much. For the idea of where and why the Navigation Acts came in, that comes in because of mercantilism. Mercantilism was an economic system centered on the belief that power influence depends on a nation's wealth, their economic self-sufficiency, and a nation can only gain wealth at the expense of another nation, controlling all economic activities, trade, imports, the idea that those exports should promote the value and the trade, and the profit is going to go towards the mother country. Raw materials, markets, all of that's there to benefit the mother country from the colonies. The policy then was put into power or put into practice through the Navigation Acts. 1660 Navigation Acts said all trade in the colonies had to be carried in English ships with at least 3/4 of an English crew. Certain products called enumerated goods, tobacco, cotton, indigo, ginger, sugar, could only be shipped to England or other English colonies, giving them a monopoly of trade over those items. For the Navigation Act of 1663, it said all colonial imports had to be shipped to England, be unloaded, have a tax put on them, and then shipped back to the colonies. And the effects of these is, again, England has a monopoly over tobacco and sugar, increases their revenue, the money that they're earning, made the commercial activities of the colonies more important as they went and as they enforced these more and more. Represents a growing imperial policy over the colonies. The Navigation Acts, again, not strictly enforced though. There's a lot of smuggling, but they are still existing there for the benefit of, again, those raw materials and that profit going towards the mother country. The Dominion of New England was created by James II, wanted to let the colonies know they were subordinate, so he consolidates them into a single colony. The goal was to undermine the authority of the church because the church was so present in the New England colonies. Church and state was combined completely, and the power that they had there over the colonies had grown. And so trying to make sure they knew who was in charge, put the governor in charge was Sir Edmund Andros. He's going to put in taxes, suppress the town governments, enforce Navigation Acts, basically trying to rein in on that area. The Glorious Revolution and the effects that it had in America. Glorious Revolution, James II is then overthrown by William and Mary, who agreed to share power with Parliament. They dissolved the Dominion of New England. All colonies revert to their former status, except Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth become united into one colony. The Massachusetts Royal Governor that William and Mary appoint had the power to veto acts of assembly to remove Puritans' religious qualification for voting. So it ends up that most of the colonies at this point, pretty much all colonies, had property qualifications, not church membership qualifications for voting. The ideas that come in with John Locke, with the two treaties of government, starts to work against and argue against the idea of divine right of kings, that people have natural rights, life, liberty, property. Government's job is to protect those rights, and if the government doesn't follow that, then people have the right to overthrow. The overthrow of James II with the Glorious Revolution, removing a hated monarch and then coming out with the same kind of political philosophy is going to then just reinforce the idea of if a government isn't doing what they're supposed to or you don't like them, you have the option to remove them. Very important when looking at the coming American Revolution. So the structure for the colonies and their governments, how they're independent, looking at general characteristics of colonial governments. They have a governor, a council, an assembly that corresponds to, or is kind of like parallel to the king, the lords, the commons in England. And the governors are going to retain the powers the king had earlier. They had the ability to veto over royal assemblies, to appoint and remove officials. Kind of helps keep their influence stable because they can reward people with a posted position. They command the militias. They grant pardons. They have a lot more power over them. The power of the colonial assemblies, England's colonies are going to benefit from this. The assemblies were, Virginia had the House of Burgesses, Maryland had the House of Delegates, Massachusetts had the House of Representatives. Lower houses were usually chosen by popular vote. Again, to vote you had to have property qualifications. Even higher property qualifications were required if you wanted to hold office yourself. And the assemblies had the ability to control the budget. They actually pay the governor's salary still at this point. And they, for a while, till about mid-18th century or so, are pretty much self-governed. They expand their own power and they don't have to answer to the king because they just ignored them. For looking into the causes of the French and Indian War, the colonial wars at this point, it had been very isolated for a while. European rivalries kind of starting to spill over into the colonies towards the end of the 17th century. Our neighbors were Spain and France. France was very close to the north. It's where most of their settlement was, or some in Louisiana area as well, but a lot of them are to the north in Canadian area. After the Glorious Revolution, kind of this reversal of English diplomacy, new king, he is going to have several wars, or they're involved in several wars. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and then finally the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. All the conflicts involved were basically for fighting England and European allies versus Catholic France or Spain and their allies. There's a lot of basically balance of power struggle, dominance struggle, trying to find a balance of power between them. Most significant is definitely the French and Indian War. The effects of this, the biggest effect was on Massachusetts. They were closest to the battlefields. It affects them the most. England winning and emerging as the most powerful nation in the world. They built a huge army and navy, but a lot of that brings in a lot of debt. So one of the biggest effects of this is going to be the debt that comes out of it. So the French Indian War itself was sparked over competing claims over the Ohio River Valley, and the French had built some forts, western Pennsylvania. George Washington, he's 21 at this point, was sent by Virginia's governor to demand that they withdraw. They say no. George Washington decided to build a new fort, but the French had beaten them to the site already, and next day they will ambush a French scouting party with the help of some Native Americans, and it's basically kind of the way the fighting would go. There's a lot of back and forth on the two. The French attack Fort Necessity, which was the fort that they had set up on site. George Washington surrenders, and the French gain control for the time in the Ohio River Valley. English government decided to show, the French that they weren't going to back down, and so they ended up capturing a lot of the French forts, expelling as many as they could in the area. General Braddock was one of the major players in this conflict. 1755, British will send 1,000 troops to Virginia. The colonists were extremely happy to have the help against the French, but will later not so much like the fact that there were so many British soldiers there. So Braddock, in charge of the soldiers, sent with the troops. They really didn't have any knowledge of the American wilderness, had a really hard time fighting. Major defeat of the British here at this one occasion. Braddock was actually mortally wounded. Washington himself was pulling people to safety. They went in unprepared. So Braddock wasn't there for the doesn't last that long. For the Albany Plan, they're going to, on the colony side, try to make a plan of union. This is led by Ben Franklin at the Albany Congress. And very central colonial government Basically, idea with a chief executive and colonial assemblies in charge of defense, Indian relations, trade, Western settlement. But the colonists say no. Ben Franklin said, if they had said yes, maybe the revolution could have happened a little differently. Had more people on board and ideas of it already set up. But the structure he proposed is what's going to kind of start the basis for the Articles of Confederation later on. In terms of this being a world war, basically the English, their colonists, and their Native American allies against the French, their colonists, and their Native American allies. And after they defeat Braddock, who was English general, the Native Americans with the French are kind of emboldened. They feel kind of inspired by the defeat. And there's widespread assaults throughout Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, a lot of fighting between the two, and England and France will formally declare war in 1756. It became part of the 7 Years' War. Fought on 4 continents, had lots of new leaders, and Britain decides to make the American colonies their primary battlefield. It's where most of the fighting happens, and again, for dominance of North America and this Ohio River Valley, who's going to be there, who's not, a fight to just who's in charge. George III takes the throne in this time, completely led the military to defeat the French and the Spanish, and will end it with the Treaty of Paris. Made England the ruler of this huge empire, becomes the largest and military strongest nation at that point, so England's feeling pretty good. Treaty of Paris, just as a helpful hint, always make sure you put the years with this because there's several treaties of Paris throughout this whole year. But they said basically that they give the land to the English. French are going to lose their land east of the Mississippi and pretty much all of Canada and Florida, any place that they had been. Spain is going to get Louisiana. It had been very heavy with French roots. French are quite humiliated. They're going to want revenge. That comes in later. They have British come out with a lot of debt. The cost of this new empire is pretty big. The idea of paying for all the troops to stay there, trying to manage the affairs. They've just taken on all this new land, which used to have other colonists from other nations, still has some of those colonists trying to keep peace as the colonists start moving farther west. And they're stretched too thin, and they don't have enough money as is, and they don't have the manpower to keep control over what they needed. So here's just kind of a map of before and after, and the British getting all of this area over here. It's a lot more to manage than the 13 colonies were originally. One other thing, looking at this map, the Proclamation Line of 1763, we'll talk about that, but I just wanted you to at least see on a map where that was. Okay, so victory from the French Indian War, and what does that mean for the colonists? So there's massive new empire to manage. Pontiac's Rebellion, as the colonists are starting to kind of take advantage of all this new western land, expand as they wanted to, transferring that land that had once been the land of French allied Native Americans to the British. The Indians are saying the French never had the right to transfer Indian land. They weren't ever conquered by the French, so it wasn't the French land to lose. England is expanding. There's Pontiac's Rebellion, named after the Ottawa chief that was in charge, very charismatic. And so the Indians are going to attack. They capture British forts. They raid colonial settlements. They felt like they had lost their allies. They were afraid of the entry of the English, and there's a lot of violence that goes on the frontier. So the British government negotiates an agreement with the Indians that says that they will allow the British to occupy the frontier forts. They will establish trade again with the Native Americans and try to keep movement west to a minimum. And that was at the Proclamation of 1763, and said that no British settlers could go west of the Appalachian Mountains. Even sent soldiers to try to enforce it, as many people tried to go anyways. Made the colonists extremely angry, feeling like they had been restricted or were being restricted. So there's another picture. A lot of the trade that happened between the British and the Native Americans often had some contaminated goods, or not, had the idea, or not the idea, but had blankets that had been contaminated with smallpox, and smallpox does not have a good history with Native American tribes. Usually could easily wipe out a good portion of the people, which then some people saw as a solution to the expansion obstacle.